Okay, yeah, so we're continuing on in schools, the article Schools as Surveilling Institutions by Haskins and Jacobson. So let's just get reacquainted with what was being said so far. So what was it looking at?
One part was parent involvement in school-related activities and how it affected the kids.
Yes, yeah, part of it is how school involvement affects children.
With the father and child contact, in that whole relationship.
Yeah, so to some degree, how much fathers are in contact with their children, particularly around schooling things. What else? What else was a big piece of what we were talking about?
Different reasons why parents have been incarcerated might want to avoid the school system.
Yeah, there's a relationship between being incarcerated and avoiding school. Does people remember what that was called? So there, we talked that we were looking at, yeah.
So the system avoidance?
Yeah, totally. It's a system avoidance. So people who've been incarcerated have system avoidance. They avoid interacting with institutions. And in that, people who've been imprisoned, the article's interested, do they have a tendency not to interact with their kids' schoolings, right? Think about schools. What do schools look like? What do they feel like? Have you ever noticed this? Yeah, you walk into a school looks like a prison even, right? You have that nice chicken wired glass everywhere, right? Good hard concrete bricks. Schools, insane asylums, prisons, they all kind of look the same. And that's largely because and this is what do schools do to kids? This is a very Foucauldian way of thinking. If anyone have learned about Foucault in any of their classes. Yeah, basically schools kind of do the same thing as prisons. Prisons watch people, schools watch people. Prisons hold bodies in space, schools hold bodies in space, right? They actually are very similar institutions. We just don't really think of that. The only difference is rather than getting out on good behavior as a result of behaving when you're being watched, you get higher grades as a result of behaving well when you're getting watched. But by and large, they kind of look and act the same way. So we were looking through their measures, right? And I believe we got through measures of parent involvement in schooling, right? Isn't that where we left off after? Does anybody have anything else in their notes? Okay, cool. That's where we left off. So the next variable, and this is the one that, does anyone remember anything about the data set that we talked about for this? What was the data set? What are some aspects of it?
As far as when they measured the kids or whatever, it was from birth all the way until they were I don't know, old, but it was every 2 years or something like that.
Yeah, every couple of years they collect more data. They had been taken at birth. At this point, the kids were 9 years old at the point when this study was done. Or at least they had full, complete data up to 9 years old, right? And it folded in more questions as people moved along, right? So when they got to being school age, they started asking questions about schooling. There was a form that teachers had to fill out, right? But originally this was gathered at the hospital, right? About parents. So that's significant when we look at this next one. So parental incarceration. So it measures it a few different ways. So, and this is on page 664. And this is a manipulation of the time set variables. So what I mean by that is it's manipulating the fact that it's a longitudinal study to pick up on different aspects of being imprisoned. So its measures are basically if they were ever incarcerated, if they were first timed incarcerated, and if they were before and by is how they describe it. So ever incarcerated. So the first way they measure that, if you go down to that second paragraph, right, these are all individual operationalizations. So they're still going through the operationalizations. That second full paragraph on the right-hand side, look through that and see if anyone can describe to me what's their operationalization. What questions are they asked? There's two measures here. Two questions on the survey that's combining. Yeah.
Is it like the questions to the teachers, like the parents attend regularly conferences, or like volunteer to help in the classroom?
Oh, nope, we're on a different area. So we're on a different variable. So we're on page 664, right-hand column. And we're looking at parental incarceration rather than parental involvement. Yeah.
One was is like ever incarcerated as far as like they marked whether the incarceration had an effect on the disadvantage facing the schooling system by the kid.
What's that? What was the last part you said?
Disadvantages faced by the kid, like in school.
We're just looking at one measure right now, right? So like if you want to think about it, like I had you guys operationalize your variables because said this is how I'm going to measure it. That's all our author has done so far in this section, right? They haven't actually gotten to what the data says, right? This is just them laying out, right, the measures. So, but the question is they so what you see is they use two sets of questions because initially they use the question, were you ever incarcerated? They ask it at the very beginning in the first interview, right? Then they ask, and this is in the teacher survey later, is the parent currently, and they ask this also on the spouse one, particularly for the fathers, right? Because they have two different sets of surveys, one for fathers, one for mothers, and they ask if the father is currently incarcerated. So basically, if you get a yes on this or a yes on this, then you get a yes on this. Have you ever been incarcerated? Well, if you're currently incarcerated, have you ever been incarcerated? Yeah, because you're currently incarcerated. If you were ever incarcerated prior to the current time, were you ever incarcerated?
Yes.
Yes. So that's how they essentially construct their first measure. But then they want to understand some other, like, more nuanced ways of understanding incarceration. So if we look at on page, and so basically they're going to still be manipulating these questions, but they're going to manipulate them differently on the basis of of when the data was collected. So on page 665, if you go all the way down to the bottom paragraph on the left-hand side that starts with the word thus, we're going to see their next variable. So what is their next variable for first time incarcerated?
It excludes fathers that have been incarcerated at the baseline or year one.
Yeah. So so basically it's taking this question, right? Were you ever incarcerated? And so if you answered yes to this in your first year, right, then for first time incarcerated, you get no. Right? If, I think it was 1, 3, 5, and 9, I believe was their the years. So basically, as you move through this time sequence, right, if you answered no, I have never been incarcerated for the first year, basically what they do is they check and they see. And if you answer yes at any point later, then you get a yes for first time incarceration. If you never answer yes, then you, just like the people who answered yes the first time, you get a no. So they constructed out of the fact that this is asked several times, a variable of whether, right, they were incarcerated for the first time since the birth of their child. Make sense? So is it something that happens later, right? Because like, you may not be as affected by your prison experience if your prison experience is 20 years ago, right? And you just happen to be incarcerated for a short period of time a long time ago. Might have a very different experience from somebody who was incarcerated when the kid was 1 year old, right? So that's oh yeah, actually I needed, and that looks like not enough times. Birth, so birth 1, 3, 5, 9. I believe is what it was. Okay, so that's the second way that they measure it, right? Once again, like these are just operationalizations. So when we say prisons affect, right, X, Y, and Z, people going to prison affects X, Y, and Z, essentially what they're looking for is they're looking for a more nuanced, does it always affect it? Does it always affect it the same way? So they operationalize this variable multiple ways. It's a very thorough study, right? Have you noticed how many operationalizations we have for each of these variables? Right, there's quite a few. Okay, the last one. You also see a lot of the kind of like data manipulation you usually get in quantitative. This is not abnormal at all for a quantitative study. You play around basically with the spreadsheets so you can measure the things that you need to be able to measure. And that's essentially what we see them doing here. So page 665. We also, if we were to get this data set, would we be able to run this same study and check them? This is a big part of what makes something scientific. Yeah. Essentially, they've given us a key telling us these are the questions that we used, and this is how we used them, and this is how we combine them. And at least hypothetically, if you were a skilled enough statistician, you'd be able to just go through this and completely replicate any of these variables. So you might look at it and be like, well, I don't think they took into account this. Well, you could pull a control variable out there, retest it, and see if you get the same findings as them. And that's essentially why these method sections exist, right? Is that what they're doing is they're sharing with you the detailed analysis of how they construct, right? So you think about like what you wrote in your research design, it's just a really simple version of this, right? Okay, so what's the, page 665, this big paragraph that says the word finally, we finally get our third measure, which is before and by. So, through this and see if anybody can tell me what this is saying. Yeah.
And so it's focusing on the group of children or experience incarceration before 7 years in
Yeah. So it's drawing a delineation, right, between fathers who are incarcerated before or by 1 year old, right? And then fathers who go on to experience subsequent. So basically, like, if you answered yes, and I erased the second one of like currently incarcerated, right? So if you got currently incarcerated anywhere after that, right, then you were coded differently. Right? So that's catching that subset of people who are being incarcerated, like, are they incarcerated beforehand and then incarcerated later? So it's catching that subset of the population that's being chronically incarcerated. Because it goes to criminology, what's the greatest predictor of being incarcerated? Previous incarceration, right? So you're talking about a different subset of the population that are being habitually. We also know that eventually everybody does what? Pretty much everybody who's incarcerated eventually stops doing what? Committing crime, right? Like everyone ages out of crime. Crime is a young man's profession. So, you know, taking like, are they people who've aged out and they're just sort of like, or are they people who are currently in the system being perpetually incarcerated? Okay. So that's our second variable. Our third major variable, and the one we could look at, is the father's system avoidance, and this is going to be on page 666. Bad omen. Okay. What is our? And you see this one in this, where it says extending work by brain, we measure, right? You guys see where that is? So, okay, there's a list of things. So here we once again get them doing a scale construction, you know, using a series of 5 binaries, so binary being yes or no, right, questions. So essentially they take these questions and they combine them together in a scale, just like they did before. What are the questions? Because there obviously isn't going to be, right? And going back to like, you use scales a lot for abstract ideas, right? Because you have to capture multiple nuances, and that's exactly what you see them doing here. They're creating a scale out of, no one's going to ask the question, do you avoid systems? Right? It's not something that's going to be on a survey, but there are all these other questions that combine. So what do they combine? This, you can see them numbered down in there.
Not working or in school.
So do you not work and you're not in school? Why would not working be a system avoidance?
Because if you're not working, what else would you be doing to provide money for anything?
So, like, but how is working a system?
It's like a daily thing that you do over and over.
Yeah, it's a daily thing you do over and over again. What else?
It's usually taxed, so you're part of the system.
Yes. Oh, sorry, I accidentally cut you off. Yeah, you're totally right. Yeah, you're involved in the tax system, right? You're connected to that system. Especially if you're thinking about more disenfranchised populations, what are their jobs usually like? Anybody hear of a low-wage job before?
Manual labor.
Could be manual labor. What jobs have people have? Anybody here ever have a crappy job?
Every job I work.
Every job is give me an example.
Like I worked for a ground crew at a golf course. It's not enjoyable, really.
Yeah, so there's grounds crew. So what was the experience of working on a grounds crew like?
You had to get up at like 4 a.m. and you'd start at like 5 a.m. and work till like 2 or 3.
Okay.
It's usually hot because it's in the summer. So
Did you have a lot of set rules on how you had to do things?
yeah, because there's like a golf course that like it's pretty like affluent and everything, so you have to keep everything nice.
Yeah. If you think about, has anybody here ever worked at like a fast food restaurant or something like that? Am I the only one with this experience? You guys are very lucky. There's like rules to everything at a fast food restaurant. So I used to be a sandwich artist. Subway sandwich artist. What's that?
Where at?
Frankenmuth, Michigan.
But like, for what fast food you want?
Oh, Subway. Subway. It was a Subway sandwich artist. They had rules at the angle at which I would have to hold my knife when I cut the bread. If you get caught, right, you can get pay docked for not cutting a loaf of bread correctly. Somebody may come in eventually and measure how thick your tomatoes are with a ruler. Right? So like, and often like fast food restaurants are very prescribed. There's also set things you were allowed to say to customers. You had to read from a script. You weren't allowed to just be like, hey, how you doing? What kind of sandwich you want? You couldn't just do that. You had to deliver the right lines. If you got caught, I never actually followed that. But if you got caught doing it, you could get in trouble. You know, there's all these rules, right? And you think about it, like it's a very institutionalized experience. Most forms of low-wage work are. As a general rule, as you move up in pay scale, right? Or at least as you move up in prestige, the less controlled you are, right? So like, this is like, you know, working as a college professor is the only job where I haven't really had a supervisor. Like nobody really, you know, occasionally like the dean comes in and sees what I'm doing, and occasionally Dr. Bryant comes in and sees what I'm doing, and I have to invite one of my friends on the faculty to come in once, which is usually actually pretty fun, right? But that's basically the extent of, like, nobody's standing over here and being like, well, on page 666 you were supposed to talk about this rather than this. Nobody does that, right? Like, you have a lot of autonomy. So you think about, like, very much so for certain populations, work. So this is the kind of thing you have to think about when you look through operationalizations. Is you have to think about to what degree are the things that they're measuring accurate? Because you could be like, work. Why is work an institution? You know, you work for like your Uncle Bob. That's not an institution. Like, why would that be institutional avoidance, right? So these are certain negotiations that you generally make as you move through and you think about somebody else's work. It's also the exact same thing that people will do to your work when you write it, right? So somebody else will go through and be like, I don't like how you define this. It didn't match what you were talking about, right? Or whatever. People will go through and do that very, very closely often. Okay. What's other things that are included in their scale of system avoidance?
Having no bank account of their own or shared with a spouse or partner.
So you don't have a bank account. This is also kind of a weird, like, shared with spouse or partner. I think I would have fallen under system avoidance on this variable. I have one joint bank account, that's it. I don't even know how much money is in it. I don't even know, like, I'd have to look up my bank account number and everything. Heck, I forget what bank I'm at. Okay. I know it's a credit union. I know it's in town. I could walk there. But I can't tell you what it is. Okay, what's our third one here?
I think they are eligible for welfare or temporary assistance to needy families in the past 12 months, but did not apply.
Yeah, so basically people avoiding aid, right? What happens if you collect aid from the government? This is something we don't usually talk about when it comes to like welfare aid. You can be suspect of the scrutiny of the state government on whether you're lying to them, whether you need it, right? So on and so forth. It's definitely a form of system avoidance. Same vein, food stamps, right? Number 5, right? They don't receive counseling, you know. They have problems with alcoholism, but don't receive help. So all these things tiled up, they use this to see, like, are they systematically avoiding systems? The higher your number gets on the scale, the more things you're avoiding, right? Is kind of the measure. Okay. As you get, when you then our author, if we flip over the page, right, then it goes into descriptive statistics. Going back to the descriptive statistics are just to see how your sample plays out. So we'll skip over that, but that's essentially what they're using it for. They're looking at the means of their different major variables, right? Then they tell us what kind of analysis they're going to do, right? They tell us what kind of study they're going to do, they tell us what sort of statistical analysis they're going to use, right? Any of those details involved there, right? And then we get into our results. Once again, our results, we have even more descriptive data, and then we get to page 672. And we get our first statistical chart, right? So this is where if you were going to read through this and you didn't want to read the results section, if you're good at reading graphs, you just flip to the graph and the graph will tell you everything. You don't actually have to sit down and read through, word by word what their results are. So if we go through here on table number 2 on page 672, what do we see? What's our variable at the top? It's a long title.
Regression models representing the association between paternal incarceration and parental involvement in school by the type of involvement. Never incarcerated by year 9 compared to never incarcerated.
Yeah. So which one? What variable are we looking at the top within that?
Parental involvement in school.
Well, the one at the top. So the one on the left is going to be the parental involvement. What's the one on the top? The incarceration. Well, we have 3 different operationalizations of incarceration. Which one's this?
Ever.
Yeah. Have you ever been incarcerated? Did they answer yes to this at any point, right? Yes or no? And so what do we see? Do you guys remember we talked about how to look at a statistical chart last time, or not last time, but earlier in the semester? What do you hunt for? You want to know if it's positive or negative? What else do you want to know?
Oh, what's that? I forget exactly what it's called, but like the gap between the 2 variables, like the 2 numbers.
You usually don't look at the numbers on a statistical chart.
You look for the stars.
You look for the stars, yeah. Because the number, unless you know, exactly how they're measuring it or what most people are scoring on it, the number itself is not, because on some of these variables, they got, you could have people up to 12 or 14. On some of these variables, you could have 2, right? So, the number is not super significant, but the stars in the plus or minus are. So what stars tell you what? What do the stars tell you?
Isn't that there's a possible variable that affects it?
Yes, but let's get another word in.
There's a correlation.
Yeah, it tells you whether there's a correlation. Is there a relationship between one and the other? Do we see any relationships here?
Yeah.
What are our relationships?
Um,
Which do we see?
School-based, mainly.
Yeah, what's that?
School-based, mainly.
Yeah, school-based involvement.
Yeah.
And school-based involvement is, how is it correlated?
There's less school-based involvement and more incarceration.
Yeah, as your score on ever incarcerated goes up, your score on school-based involvement goes down, right? It's true across, so they do 2 different tests. It's true with both of the tests, right? Did they necessarily have to do 2 separate tests? No, this is an incredibly thorough study, right? So there we go. What do we see when we see that again, right, for both of them? So you see stars and a negative sign. With home-based, we see it in one, but not the other. 2, look at that note at the bottom. That is a hefty note. What are they doing there? What are they telling us there? Something really important. Especially, what is that massive list? Yeah, so look at all those things they controlled for. That is a lot of control variables. Right? As I said, that's kind of rare in sociology, but really common in economics. But yeah, I mean, there's like a massive number of control variables. They've control for all those, right, all the way across. Okay, table 3, right? Same thing, but this time we're going to get first-time incarcerated people, right? So, incarcerated for the first time, right, between years 1 and 9. So that's our second measure. And this is kind of bizarre. You know, something, this is not totally not what I think I would predict. What do they find? For people who are incarcerated for the first time between their kids, after their kid was 1 and before their kid was 9. What do we see about the stars in the direction?
It's more on the father's self-reports than primary caregiver.
What's that? Oh, yeah, it correlates with the fathers, but the primary caregiver, yeah, the primary caregiver. So, like, mothers do not report that their involvement went down, right? That essentially there's no relationship from the perception of mothers. Fathers have a tendency to have it statistically significant. So within our tests, right, having 2 separate tests here, the prior table, right, found more support for ever than they did for people who are incarcerated after their kids were already born, which is acting like really a little bizarre. Right? So, okay, next one, page 674. What do we see? What do you notice about the stars and the minuses? First of all, which one is this? This is
Before, by, or before and by.
yeah, this is the before and by. So the one where they remove out anyone who wasn't incarcerated, I guess specifically during that time period. Okay, you guys get the point? Okay, cool. We'll look at one last. So on all 3 you get connections, and they also get in connection, if you look farther on, right, they also get connection for the idea of there being a system of avoidance, right? So we won't look at that chart specifically, but that's in essence. So what we see is that's basically a tutorial on how you read between the 2, right? How you read a statistical method section and then the results section. So any questions about that? Cool, let's move on to the next one. Okay. Very different article for this week, right? What's our article for this week on? And what kind of method are they using?
About rhino poaching?
Yeah, it's about rhino poaching.
And they interview kind of
It's an interview study, qualitative interview study.
Empirical research on like the rhinos of poaching.
On the what?
On poaching of rhinos.
Yeah. Exactly. They collect more about like people's attitudes surrounding it, right? So thinking about what you use qualitative for, like this isn't a numerical study on whether rhino poaching is going up or down, right? They're interested in the sort of complex motivations of people who poach rhinos. Okay. How do people have, so did anybody catch how, and this discussion is in this introduction on page 428. So just like in all of your studies, right, they review the literature and they find how their study is going to fit in with it, right? So, in this initial section in the introduction, did anybody catch how people generally explained poaching in the past? Which is going to be different from our study. Yeah.
I think it was for money.
Yeah, so one thing that they,
And thrill seeking, right?
yeah, so the two explanations for poaching is thrill seeking. The other is poverty. Where does this study take place, by the way?
South Africa.
Yep, takes place in South Africa. Totally had like a mustache hair fall off. And now it's like in my mouth, inside the mask. It's so annoying. Okay, I think I got it out. Okay, so yeah, so those are the two ways in which previously was. So what's the problem that our author has on that about these as explanations? Yeah.
I think he saw the ones that were poaching for poverty, or because they were in poverty, they were more punished than the ones that were poaching for like adventures, seeking.
Oh, sorry, I didn't hear what you said.
The ones poaching for, because they were in poverty, were more harshly punished, especially because they were villagers that like lived in the regions of the RIS, but the ones that were poaching for fun were not as harshly punished because they brought in a lot of tourism and like benefits to the states and stuff.
So yeah, the thrill-seeking poaching is not super common, but also somewhat supported by the state. They allow it, and they kind of look the other way. What about poverty as an explanation? And this is true in general. This is more of a general argument about crime. Anybody catch this? How comfortable are criminologists usually with the explanation of poverty causing crime?
Really comfortable.
What's that?
Really comfortable. Is it like there's no empirical evidence to support it?
Yeah, generally speaking, most criminologists don't think that poverty can be proven as having any relationship to criminal activity. So it's kind of like, is this just us kind of like stereotyping the motivations? Because the thing is, we take, as we get towards the end of the article, right? Do most people who are living around in poverty but living around the park system, do they poach?
Yeah.
Barely any, percentage-wise, barely any of them do. So how can that be the major explanation, right? So, and that's really kind of the issue often. Like, that's why statistically speaking, poverty isn't generally associated with crime, because most people who are poor don't commit the crimes that you look at any given time, right? So there doesn't really seem to be much of a relationship between poverty and crime. Despite the fact that we have very clear cultural prejudice that would be the case. So our author instead wants to look at and figure out basically what are the motivations, right? What are the motivations for poaching? Okay, so that's kind of the setup. Let's get to page 429. Let's start talking about the methods here. So what kind of studies are they doing? Let's start that at the very beginning. I might have this read it. This is packed enough I could have people read aloud. Would anybody want to volunteer to start us out?
I'll go. On the first sentence.
Yeah, where it says the research.
All right. The research for this article emanates from a multi-sided ethnography.
Okay, I'm gonna pause you there. What is that? What do you think? We didn't talk about this, but I think you can probably guess it just from the word. I know you guys hate it when I make you guess. Go ahead.
Like customs or something?
What's that?
Like customs in like that area?
So what would it mean to have a multi-sided ethnography?
Like a research project, like a,
Different views.
Maybe like a study in different areas, like multiple areas of like the culture that's there, and the traditions and rituals of like people there around rhino culture.
Yeah, so it's multi-sided, meaning you go to more than one place. That's all that that means, right? So they did a multi-sided ethnography, right? Keep on going.
in which I used to follow the thing approach by tracing the social relations and structures underpinning the movement of rhino horn from the South African bush to Southeastern Asian markets.
Okay, so he used a follow the thing approach. I love that. I've never seen that before, but I love it. It maybe is, well, he cites somebody, so he didn't make it up. Apaduri made it up, who's actually a pretty famous researcher. Okay, so what is the, so what do you want to guess a follow the thing approach?
You follow the thing you're studying.
Yeah, so what is he following?
The rhino
Horn.
Yeah, he's following dead rhinos as they trample. He follows the thing approach. What he's talking about is basically that he's following a supply chain, right? I just love the hyphenated follow the thing, right? So yeah, so basically, you know, you start out and some guy kills a rhino, right? And takes the horn, which is the only part that they care about. And then they follow, right? He follows the thing as it travels from place to place. And where does he track it all the way to? This is pretty impressive.
Asia.
Yeah, so he inevitably tracks it until some guy, right, comes with money to South Africa to buy rhino horns to take to Asia. Okay, so he follows the thing. It doesn't get much more descriptive than that. Okay, do you want to keep going or do you want to grab somebody else?
I'll keep going.
Okay.
More than 420 research informants participated in interviews and focus groups during 14 months of field work in
Okay.
2000
Oh, sorry, go ahead. Finish that section.
in 2012 and 2013.
Okay, so anyone notice anything about that? Especially considering what we said about interviews. How many people did they
It's kind of a
interview?
lot of research informants. Yeah.
Yeah, this is a massive project, right? 420 people is a really high N. By the way, that's what researchers call the number of people you work with, a really high N, right, for a qualitative study. Did it for 14 months, right? That's a long time. A lot of people interview in that narrow of a period of time, right? Okay. And keep on going, it gets better.
And follow-up visits were conducted in 2015 and 2016.
So he interviewed 420 people more than once, right? So he did a complete second follow-up study. Okay, keep on going if you want.
All right. The sample included, among others, convicted and active rhino poachers, kingpins, smugglers, organized crime investigators, private anti-poaching operatives, and state security forces, as well as affected local communities.
Okay, so he doesn't specifically say this, but what kind of sample is that? Or somebody comes up with it. This is something we learned. So we'll start here. Is it a probability sample?
No.
No. He doesn't, is it a snowball sample? Does he say anything about starting with a small number of people? And
No.
no. This is the second article we have with this type of sample as well. The other one was quantitative. It's a purposive sample, right? She's pulling, right, from multiple perspectives within the communities surrounding rhino poaching, right? So will poachers necessarily have the same perspective as organized crime investigators or local communities? No, so she's making sure that she gets a fair sampling of everybody around. It's pretty impressive that she manages to interview both soldiers with a kill-on-sight order for poachers and kingpins of poaching organizations, right? This is pretty impressive. Yeah. So that's basically, those are the major things that I wanted to pull out there, right? Let's leap down. So just so we know where we're looking at, we already mentioned South Africa, right? Does anybody catch what kind of place this is?
National Park.
Yeah, so it's 2 national parks basically is where she's doing her research. One is in South Africa proper, one is in Mozambique. Okay. And unlike, so here we get like our quantitative methodology. How big was our methodology section? Particularly think of that last one. How meaty was that methodology section? What's that?
It was a lot.
Yeah, it was almost a third of the article where they told you how they were going to measure their variables and whatnot, right? How long is our methodology section here?
Big.
Yeah, they tell you how they sampled people, right? They tell you, they tell you quite a bit of detail about that, right? How they went about finding them, right? The follow the thing approach. Favorite thing out of this article, I can't help it. Right, they told you where it was at, right? But once that, are they going to give us any information about how they coded the information that they got, or any of that? No, they're just going to leave that all latent, right? And part of that is getting back into that difference in qualitative and quantitative study. Could you replicate this study?
It'd be hard to do really hard.
Probably not, right? You may not have the, I just can't be you might not have the right connections, but even if you went there and you started interviewing people, there's no guarantee that you'd hit similar people with similar views, right? It's no guarantee that in the time that it would take you to do this, it took this person 4 years, right, to do this one study, right? People change. You might find something very different, right? It's not very replicatable. So there's not as much of an interest in sharing as many details about it, right? Since you can't do that. Well, if you went there and did a similar study, right, you would have high reliability, you'd probably see what you saw, right? But you wouldn't have high replicability. Okay, so our author from there, okay, cool. Our author from there is going to look at so starting on page 431, we're going to look at some of the context here. So this is something we usually don't think about, right? So we hear about poaching, people talk about poaching, how animals are dying off, right? I almost came in, does anybody here listen to new wave music? I'm the only post-punk weirdo. There's this really famous new wave song, Lone Rhinoceros. Anyways, I almost came in and played it. I was like, this is not really connected, right? So this does show, like, there's like, you know, the 1980s, there was this big thing to the point where, like, you know, sort of like new wave punk bands were like, yeah, I'm going to sing a song about the rhinos, right? Like, and then being poached. We often know very little about the context, right, of national park systems. And it's actually true both here and other places. So did anybody catch anything about the national park system, where it came from in South Africa? This section.
It came from the colonial period whenever they were colonized by European countries.
So yeah, it was pretty late in their colonialism, right? This in the 19th century, so British colonialism. And how did what did they declare? Ooh. Who lives in the places, or who uses the places that become the park system? Primarily, when they're being. Can you catch this? Yeah.
Isn't it kind of like the people that were already living there, like localized tribes and stuff?
Yeah. The indigenous people of South Africa used this land as a burial ground and as the places where they hunted for food, right? So what happens in colonialism to form this? What do the colonial authorities call it? They declare it something.
For uninhabited land.
Yeah, they declare it as uninhabited. So it's essentially how people are providing their livelihood, and yet they declare it as uninhabited and they close people off from it, right? This is actually a really common story for the formation of national parks. Anybody here ever been to the Smoky Mountains? No? Anybody here ever heard of the Smoky Mountains? Smoky Mountains is one of the biggest, on this half of the country, one of the biggest national parks. Does anybody know what it was before it was a national park? It was farmland. They went through, they kicked off all of the poor white people living in the Appalachian Mountains off of their land, didn't pay them for it, and then built a national park. That's the first national park in the western or the eastern half of the United States, right? Does anybody know of any populations that currently live on a fair number of national parks in the United States? Native Americans, right? Native Americans who live in national parks have no rights to the lands that they live on, right? They just live there. And it's a very similar history, right? So we have this history of dispossession, right? That goes back, but you still have people living on these national parks in Kenya. So, okay, so from there, does anybody know, there's a specific reference to a specific policy here. It's very famous in South African history. So we have that first wave of dispossession. Yeah, the apartheid system. Has anybody ever heard of apartheid before?
I have, but I can't define it.
Yeah, we had a similar system in the United States. Does anybody know the system in the early 20th century we had for where people could live on the basis of race in the United States? Before Brown versus the Education, after Plessy versus Ferguson. So between 1914 and the 1960s. Do you know this history?
Zoning?
What's that?
The zoning?
It's stricter than zoning.
Segregation.
Yeah, the United States had a system of segregation, right? This is the same reason why if you go down, now it's called Unity, before it was called Division, right? There's all these abandoned schools down here. Has anybody driven down there? Does anybody know what those schools are? They were the African American schools before segregation, right? They weren't allowed to go to the same schools, right? You placed them in one place or another. Under segregation, specific people had to live in specific parts of the town. Atchison was a segregated town at that time. African Americans were only allowed to live in certain districts. White people were only allowed to live in certain districts. They were removed from one another. This is essentially what apartheid is. Apartheid is this big national system of segregation. Does anybody know when South Africa became, so in the 1960s is when it happened in the United States. Does anybody know when South Africa, when apartheid ended?
1980s, 1990s.
1990s, yeah. So in the 1990s it ended. So fairly recent history. So when they did that, just like they did in the United States, so in the United States when they declared segregation, they essentially became a system of relocation often. So, so after Plessy versus Ferguson, people could declare districts and force African Americans out of their neighborhoods and into other places if they wanted to. And it happened quite a bit. Same thing, even on a grander scale, happened in the apartheid system. So the apartheid system is basically a harsher version of segregation. And so apartheid, what they do is they took various parts of the country and forced people to move, even sometimes whole regions. And then you're only allowed to work in certain places and only allowed to live in certain places, right? During this, what became the relationship of indigenous peoples to the park system? What do you think?
Is there a pretty poor relation?
Yeah, so essentially they're forced, again, it's another wave of dispossession. They're forced even further out. What land rights they have there are often threatened. And the reason why is because essentially, like, what do we use the park system for in South Africa? Who uses it? Tourists. And where do those tourists come from?
Elsewhere.
Let's get some specific elsewheres. Who shows up halfway across the world to take some pictures of some big animals?
American.
Both answers are acceptable. yeah. It's Americans, it's Europeans, it's white people. White people go to Africa to take pictures of animals. That's exactly. And so, like, you're talking about, you know, during apartheid, why would you remove all the indigenous people from the park? What do you think? What's that? I heard somebody say something.
Money?
So yeah, you want money, inevitably, yeah, that's not. It's because the tourists don't want to come there and be surrounded by people who are different from them. They're going to feel threatened by it, right? So essentially what you do is you dispossess people further, send them further out, make sure that they don't get to interact with anybody who's going to show up as a tourist, right? And so that's essentially what happens. Then, and this is a pretty ironic piece of the history, so apartheid ends, and what happens to the indigenous people? What do people all of a sudden want to see in their parks?
Indigenous people.
Indigenous people, so what do they do? Yeah! They're like, it'll be better for tourism if we have indigenous villages. People will be like, yay, excited. So they just move them back in again. Right? Right? So you're getting kind of like, this is wonky history going on. So then they're having problems with poaching, and what do they do to the indigenous populations living in the national parks? They move them back out again. Right? So you get basically this population being moved in and out surrounding these parks. Right? This constant system of resettlement. And how easy is that on people, by the way? So like let's imagine, right? You're growing up, living your life wherever your parents are, and then the government's like, okay, you got to move 200 miles that way. They pick you up, they move you. Right? You don't have a choice. They tell you, oh wait, they move you 200 miles back. Over a course of 100 years, they do this to your family 4 times. Right? And right now you're living basically in what looks like government housing. Originally they were supposed to supply you with farmland so you could make a living, but then they sold it off to a corporation instead. right? And that's essentially the situation we're looking at. It's a historical context of the relationship, right, between this population and, right? So that's that section. Okay, I think we'll round out there for today. I'm guessing that we will probably not get enough time on Thursday to talk about the article because we have what?
Presentations.
Presentations, yeah. So for those of you who are at home, attend via Blackboard Collaborate. I will not be posting a video on Thursday. For those of you here, if you are still capable of being present, do. If you are no longer capable of being present by Thursday, but are in sound enough health to be here, attend by Blackboard Collaborate. So, have a great day.